for that kind introduction. I just want to check, first of all, that the people at the back can hear clearly and see the screen. There will be some things on the screen which will be quite small, but if they're too small, I will read them aloud. It's a great honor and a pleasure to be here. And this year is a significant year in many respects, because it marks 20 years since my colleague Ronald Carter and I published our first papers about spoken grammar. And when we first published these papers, one of them was in the journal Applied Linguistics, and the other was in the English Language Teaching Journal, we created something of a storm. Looking back, it was a storm in a teacup. But at the time, it felt like a bigger storm, because people reacted very strongly. They said, "Oh, spoken grammar? What is this? Is this the grammar of the lazy teenagers at the bus stop? What on earth is this?" Then, 10 years later, in 2006, Ronald Carter and I published a big grammar book, which you can have a look at outside, the Cambridge Grammar of English. And this created an even bigger storm. And we were attacked in the national media. We had to go on to the BBC, onto the radio, and defend our view of grammar. One of the most famous newspapers in Britain, the Daily Telegraph, had an article with the headline, "Grammar and Bad Manners." Okay? And then the article attacked me and Ronald Carter for including in our grammar book the grammar of everyday speaking. Now, the Daily Telegraph is a very conservative newspaper, so we consoled ourselves with the idea that if we were attacked by the Daily Telegraph, we must be doing something right. But it did create quite a storm, and I want to show you today that spoken grammar is nothing to be afraid of. It is the grammar that we use every day in our spoken interaction with our fellow human beings. And I want to argue that it is what makes us human. It is what defines us as human beings, this ability to use grammar to interact, right? So this works. In each case, I'm just going to show you some illustrations of spoken grammar, and then I'm going to tell you why I think they are important for language teaching and language learning, and for the understanding of language in general. But I'm a university academic, I'm a professor, so I have to start by looking at the academic background, the research background to spoken grammar. So we're going to start by looking at some things that have been said and written, discussions of spoken grammar. And I'll step over here so that the good people here can all see the screen. But if I fall down the stairs, please rescue me. My very great friend and colleague, the late David Brazil, spelled like the country but pronounced Brazil, David Brazil in 1995, he was describing everyday speaking. And he said, item succeeds item along the time dimension. Now that's very important. We're not talking about a page, which is a physical dimension. Spoken grammar occurs in time, in real time. It happens. We do not necessarily have to assume that the consideration of such abstract notions as sentences enters into the user's scheme of things at all. Put simply, what Brazil is saying is that the notion of a sentence, really, we can't assume that that applies to spoken grammar. The units of communication in spoken grammar might be something else. You know, we don't go up to our friends and say, capital H, how are you, comma, today, question mark. Capital I apostrophe M, very well, comma, thank you, full stop. So when we speak, we're doing something else. We are using the grammar, but our concern is not to create sentences. We have other priorities, much more important ones. Carter and McCarthy, well, I quote myself here. It's a bit arrogant to quote oneself, but I quote it because it's probably Ronald Carter who had the idea, not me. In 1995, we published papers showing that common grammatical features found in a conversational corpus were rare or which functioned differently in writing. Let me put this in a simple way. We used a corpus. A corpus is a collection of texts stored in a computer. That's all it is. The internet is a corpus. You can search the internet and get 10,000 examples of your search term, for example. We looked at a corpus of conversational English, and what struck us, what really hit us in the face, was the number of times that we find very common, frequent grammatical features in conversation, which were rare in writing, or which functioned differently in writing. And I'll come back to these points in a moment. But that was our main finding, if you like, in 1995. By the way, I should say, I see people taking notes here, and I'm most flattered. What I'm going to say this afternoon is now published in an article which you can access online if you search for Applied Linguistics. That's the name of the journal. I have to say this, it's not published by Cambridge, it's published by another famous university, okay? But we dare not mention its name. We who live in Cambridge and who studied in Cambridge always refer to it as another place, right? So the article is published in another place in the Journal of Applied Linguistics, and if you just put in spoken grammar, Carter, McCarthy, you will find it. But please feel free to take notes anyway. Douglas Biber and his colleagues at the University of Northern Arizona, in Flagstaff, Arizona, in 1999 published a major grammar, and they called it a grammar of spoken and written English. And this was one of the first big grammars to make that division between the grammar of speaking and the grammar of writing. And this is what they found. They found that differences of distribution and function of grammatical items across 4 types of language. They looked at fiction writing, novels and so on, short stories. They looked at newspapers, news writing. They looked at academic writing. And they looked at everyday conversation. And of course, the grammar was different in these 4 categories. But the biggest difference of all was between conversation and the other 3. Conversation emerged as very special indeed. Now you might think, well, it must be academic writing which is the most special, the most different. Not true. The most different, the most special was conversation. The late great grammarian Geoffrey Leach, who sadly died a couple of years ago, in the year 2000, made the same point. He said it is often conversational data that is different from the rest. So there's something about conversation which marks it out as different from other types of grammar. I'm going to probably pull this thing out here. Conversation reflects online linear nature in the brevity of utterances. So the first thing you notice when you look at spoken grammar is people don't speak in long sentences with many clauses. So the turns are quite brief, quite short. It's just it's like a tennis game. It's going back and forth all the time. Only the most boring people speak in sentences of 50 words with 3 subordinate clauses and 2 non-finite clauses and disjunct and an adjunct thrown in for good measure. Words and phrases, rather than long clauses or heavily embedded structures, predominate. So that's the first point. When we look at everyday speaking, everyday conversation, the unit of communication is the phrase or the clause, not the sentence. We'll come back to that. Ruhlmann, a young German linguist, watched his name. He's going to become more and more famous as a grammarian. In 2007, Ruhlmann said, work done on grammar in spoken corpora should better be termed conversational grammar. So he gets to the heart of it. He says, don't call it spoken grammar, call it conversational grammar, because that is where the most important differences lie. Since it is there, it is in conversation that we find the most outstanding differences between speaking and writing. Okay, that's what the scholars have said. Now we're going to look at some real speaking and at the grammar of real speaking. I'm going to show you a series of extracts from spoken corpora, real people speaking. And in each case, we're going to focus on a different aspect of spoken grammar. We're going to start our core features with what has been called co-construction. Now, I'm going to use a certain amount of terminology in this talk, but please don't be scared or impressed by terminology. Behind every piece of terminology, there should be a very simple idea. Co-construction means simply building things together. I want to show you how this works. If you want to read more about co-construction, by the way, I published an article in 2001 with an outstanding Chinese linguist called Hong-Yin Tao, who works at the University of California, Los Angeles, and he and I worked together in the United States. And then later, I published in 2015 an article with my colleague Brian Clancy at the University of Limerick in Ireland. Let's have a look at an extract, people talking. These are students chatting. The first student says, so I've no lectures. I've to do the research myself. And the second student says, you've to do it yourself. And a third student says, which is harder, like? Sorry, the S3, the same student there. Then a different student says, which would be very difficult, I'd say. And number 3 says, yeah. Now, the important thing to note here is there are 3 people involved in creating what a grammarian would call one sentence. It has a main clause. I have to do the research myself. And it has 2 subordinate clauses, which is harder, which would be very difficult. One of the subordinate clauses is spoken by the same speaker who said the main clause. The other one is spoken by a different person who hops in and hooks a subordinate clause on the other person's sentence. But the first speaker doesn't say, you stay out of my sentence. This is my sentence. You make your own sentence. You make your own subordinate clauses if you don't mind. Of course not. Because this happens time after time after time. What we can see as, quote unquote, a sentence in spoken grammar is often created by 2 or even 3 people. We construct the grammar together. We do it with clauses with which. This is extremely frequent. Huh? Those tickets for the concert cost me $200. And the other person says, which is expensive. Yeah, which is expensive. We also do it with clauses with if. We could go to the beach tomorrow, says one speaker. The other speaker might say, if it doesn't rain, if the weather's fine. And always on those occasions, this is seen as satisfactory. It is seen as grammatical. Nobody says, who do you think you are hanging a subordinate clause on my main clause? Nobody ever says that. We have no evidence of that whatsoever. So co-construction is a fundamental feature of everyday spoken grammar. We create together the grammatical structures. It's not difficult, actually. It's fairly simple, straightforward stuff. Now, why is it important, or why do I think it's important? It's important because it facilitates, it makes easier interpersonal bonding. That is absolutely at the heart of this. It brings you closer to your fellow human beings. It creates a close relationship. It enables what linguists call the negotiation of meaning. I don't know 100% what you mean when you say, I have to do the research myself. Do you mean I'm proud of that? Or I find it difficult? Or I'm the most wonderful researcher in the world? What exactly are you saying when you say I have to do all the research myself? That meaning is negotiated. They work towards an agreed meaning of doing research yourself. And that agreed meaning is that it's something difficult. It's quite hard. If you have no lectures, you have to do all the work yourself. So the negotiation of meaning, we move towards meanings by co-constructing the grammar. And of course, above all, it creates conversational flow. It enables the conversation to flow. It connects each speaker's turn with what went before. And we know from research evidence, and I shall talk about this in a different lecture, that fluency, the feeling that conversation is flowing, is fundamentally created by the way we can attach what we say to what the other person has just said. So this kind of co-construction is very important in the creation of what I call confluence, flowing together, all the speakers making the conversation flow like a river. That's where the word fluent comes from. The word fluent comes from the Latin verb fluere, meaning to flow like a river. So when conversation flows and connects, we say, gosh, he's fluent in English. She's fluent in Japanese, because they can make the conversation flow. Okay, let's have a look at another feature, shall we? I say, shall we? You're not allowed to say no, are you? Not really. I want to look at an interesting case now. I want to talk a bit more about subordinate clauses. Now, we all remember from our grammar lessons that a main clause is a clause that can stand alone. It's an independent clause. It has its own legs. A subordinate clause doesn't have much meaning on its own. So if I walk into a room and I say, if it's fine, they're going to look at me and say, what? What? So what if it's fine? I said, nothing. So subordinate clauses traditionally are defined by their necessity to bind with main clauses. However, when we look at everyday conversation, we see all sorts of examples of subordinate clauses that don't look terribly attached to their main clauses. If you'd sign here, please. That's what the front desk at the hotel said to me last night when I checked in. In beautiful English, he put a piece of paper in front of me and said, if you'd sign here, please. And I didn't say, what? What will happen? Will I win the lottery if I sign here? No. It looks like an if clause, but of course it's just a polite request. And many, many examples of if clauses are not conditional clauses. They are simply ways of making a request. If you'd follow me, please. If you'd just be quiet for a minute. Yeah. Here's another one. Is Julia here? Oh, she is. There she is, yes. I made this before I came to Russia and met Julia. Is Julia here? Because I need to speak to her. Because I need to speak to her. Now, because clauses express what? They express consequence, result. This seems to be Very strange. Is Julia here because I need to speak to her? So if someone says, no, she's not here, does that mean I don't need to speak to her? No. So the logic of the subordinate main clause relationship breaks down. It simply means this is why I'm asking. It's saying, I should tell you why I'm asking, is Julia here? So the relationship between the subordinate clause and the main clause is quite different from what it would be in writing. Think of it when someone says, there's beer in the fridge if you're thirsty. Now if I say, no, I'm not thirsty, the beer magically disappears from the fridge. No, of course not. There's beer in the fridge if you are thirsty simply means there is beer in the fridge and you might be thirsty. Okay, so we have a special kind of subordinate clause relationship in speaking. In everyday conversation, you do this, we do this all the time. There's nothing special or magical about this. These clauses are important because they facilitate natural phrasal clausal structure of conversation. We do not need to create perfect sentences with main clauses and subordinate clauses. We can just say, if you'd sign here, please. And nobody says, yeah, I'm waiting for your main clause. That's the conditional clause. Where's the main clause? No, of course not. They enable very natural turn-taking. You don't have to sweat and think, how am I going to make a sentence? Now, I studied Spanish at university. I studied at a very prestigious, very famous university, this one in fact, Cambridge. Wonderful experience. I studied Spanish literature, and then I did my PhD there. And at the end of it all, I had a massive, massive vocabulary. I had about 36 different words for kinds of hills and mountains. I had words for every architectural detail of the hinges on 14th century cathedral doors. Then I went to Spain. I was a very young man. I had two ambitions: to improve my Spanish and to meet the most beautiful Spanish señorita and have a girlfriend. I failed on both counts. It's the story of my life. I failed on both counts. But I failed because my English was not very natural. I would have been terrified of saying a freestanding subordinate clause because I had been taught how to construct Spanish sentences with main clauses and subordinate clauses. Nobody ever told me that I could say something like, if you like. I thought I had to say, yes, I would like to go to the beach if you like. And of course you start those sentences and it's like going into a very dark tunnel. And there's light at the end of the tunnel, but you're not sure if it's an oncoming train. Disaster. Destroying the conversation because you're sweating the stress of creating these perfect sentences. When all the evidence is that natural conversation proceeds in a series of clauses, phrases, and shorter utterances. We have very little evidence that people create well-formed sentences. They do it now in lectures and formal broadcasts on radio and television, but real people in real situations, in real streets and real houses and real cafes and real offices don't create perfect sentences. So it enables us to take the focus away from sentences. Okay, moving on. Moving on. The next core feature is the strategic use of the tense and aspect system. Okay, we're going to look at tense. And English has two tenses, present and past. And English has several aspects. We have continuous or progressive versus simple. We have perfect versus non-perfect. That kind of thing. Now, I don't know any Russian, but somebody told me that Russian has also several aspects. Yeah? bit of doubt down here, so I'll see. Sorry? Right, okay. Well, it's just as well I don't know any Russian then. Now, this is taken from a conversation between a customer and a travel agent. And the customer says, "We were wanting to book a trip to Sardinia." And guess what the travel agent says next? "Oh, have you changed your mind? Why are you here if you don't want it anymore?" So no, of course, the travel agent interprets this as a polite way of saying "we want." So you have degrees of respect and distance. It is perfectly correct to say "we want to book a trip to Sardinia." It is perfectly correct to say "we are wanting to book a trip to Sardinia." It is perfectly correct to say "we wanted to book a trip to Sardinia." It is perfectly correct to say "we were wanting to book a trip to Sardinia." They all mean the same. They are all correct grammar, but they express different degrees of indirectness, politeness, friendliness towards the person who is serving you. People who are serving you do not like to be considered as slaves. They like to be considered as human beings who are respected and esteemed. So this is a case of what in the linguistic literature would be called, would be related to politeness theory, to negative politeness. I'm saying I'm not threatening you, I'm not demanding too much of you. This is a way of saying, I realize that you're going to help me. The next one is one of my favorites. I took a jacket to the cleaners. I put the jacket down on the counter and I said, "I would like to have this dry cleaned, please." And the woman behind the counter said, "Yes, what was the name?" What was the name? And I said, "Well, it's the same as it's always been. I've never changed it in my life." So again, you see, this is the exploitation of the past tense. "What is your name?" is perfectly correct, but it sounds a little bit like a police interrogation, doesn't it? What is your name? Where were you at 4 o'clock when you spilled beer onto this jacket? Did anybody witness the spilling of the beer onto your jacket? Would you be prepared to sign a statement under oath that this beer was your own beer and not somebody else's beer that you spilled on it? So all the time we have this way of using the grammar to create a more humane relationship with your fellow human beings. It's what defines us as human beings. It's nothing special about being British or being American. All languages enable the grammar to be used strategically to create better human relations. And that is what is at the heart of spoken grammar. There really is only one key concept, and that is better human relations. This is one that interests me. We have more than 200 examples of this in our corpus. Sally was telling me they're moving to Birmingham. Now, if you look at all of the main grammar references for English and all of your textbooks in university and so on, you will find a chapter or a section on reporting speech. Yeah? So we all know the classic exercises. Mary says, "We're moving to Birmingham." And you have to report that. You say, "Mary told me she's moving to Birmingham. Mary said she was moving to Birmingham. Mary informed us that she was moving to Birmingham." And we get our students to use the past tense. She told us, she said, she informed us. Then we look at real people speaking, and we find hundreds of examples of "she was telling me," "she was saying." I was reading in the paper the other day. I was reading in the paper that they're going to lower taxes. Mary was saying that they're going to close the supermarket. So what is this? We have hundreds of examples, and you don't find it in the grammar books. The reason you don't find it is that it is hardly ever used in writing. You will not find this in writing. You will not pick up your newspaper in Britain and see the Prime Minister was saying the other day in the Houses of Parliament. No, it's always the Prime Minister said, the Prime Minister stated, the Prime Minister informed Parliament, the Prime Minister commented. But if you look at spoken language, we find hundreds of examples of this past continuous. Sally was telling me, Mary was saying, I was reading. When you look at all of the examples, what becomes clear is this is a way of signaling that you have something interesting to say. It always comes before interesting news. It doesn't come before straightforward speech reports. It's a little flag. It's a little way of saying, I've got something to tell you. You know, listen to me, I've got news. And that use of the past progressive, the past continuous, is what we might call a topical signal. And it is sympathetic towards your listener. It's a way of saying, what I have to say will be interesting for you. It's a matter of interest for you. Now, it's a very small grammatical point, but to me, it typifies the way grammar books were written. And that is, they were based on the evidence of written texts, based on introspection. You know, you sit down and think, now, how do we say this? What do we say? That's the worst thing you can do. There's only one worse thing than that, and that is to sit down and say, what did they teach me at school? That's the worst of all. What we have to do is to be able to step back from speaking, from conversation, and say, how does it work? Now, the evidence of research shows that native speakers are not good at knowing what they say. Okay? You can test native speakers on what they write or what they were taught at school, and they can tell you. But the research evidence is that people are not very good at what they say when they're speaking. A very famous paper by a British linguist called Richard Watts. And he did an interesting experiment. He got together some of his educated, middle-class friends, and he said, you know, I'd like to offer you a glass of wine or some tea or coffee, and I'd like to record you so that I can play it to my students who are learning English. And his friends said, yes, of course. So they got together, and Richard Watts said, I'd like you to give me your opinions about the current state of the English language. The beautiful language of Shakespeare and Chaucer and Wordsworth and Keats. What is its present condition? Is it in a good situation, or is it going to hell in a handcart? And of course they all said, it's going downhill. English is going to the dogs. They said, why? They said, well, it's these young people. They cannot say a sentence without saying like, or whatever, or stuff, and, you know. Their grammar is terrible. They cannot create a sentence without all those words in it. Anyway, he recorded their conversations. Then he transcribed exactly what they had said. And guess what? Of course, what they said was, well, I mean, like, it's these young people, you know, or whatever. Their grammar, you know, like, is terrible. They can't, you know, like, they can't say a sentence without saying like 10 times, you know, like. So it was a very serious piece of research that showed that native speakers are not very good at observing how they speak. It is no coincidence that all the famous grammars of English until the 20th century were written by non-native speakers of English. They were Danes, they were Norwegians, Jacobsen, Svartvik, Zandvoort, they were from the Netherlands, they were from Denmark, they were from Sweden, because they were able to observe from the outside objectively. Nowadays we can do the same with a computer. We can ask the computer to tell us, what do people really say? The computer has no prejudices. The computer is very lucky because it never went to school and it was never taught grammar. The computer simply observes the data and says, this is what we find in the data. You may not like it. You may say, well, I don't speak like that. I have faced audiences like this one where members of the audience have said, well, that was very interesting. But, you know, I never say things like, you know. Yeah, really. So we have to learn somehow to step back from the spoken language and say, what is it like? How does it really function? And the corpus enables us to do that. Tense aspect choices are important because they facilitate, they make easy politeness and indirectness. We've seen examples of that. Good relations. We keep coming back to this all the time, that the grammar is about the relationship. Expressing speaker perspectives. There's something very simple about the grammar, and that is that tense and aspect are, of course, used to talk about time. We talk about the present. We talk about the past. We talk about the future, etc. But by manipulating and exploiting the aspect system, the continuous and simple, we can express our perspective, our position with regard to the events. So we are not prisoners of the meanings of time. We can exploit those meanings to create better relations with other people, to create politeness, and so on. And let's move on. Only a couple more, and then we'll be able to finish. I keep looking at my watch, thinking, what time did we start, by the way? I can't remember. Quite 10 past 4, yes, okay. The next feature I'd like to look at is what my colleague Ronald Carter and I call headers and tails, which we published in our grammar in 2006, and also in another grammar in 2011 by Ronald Carter, myself, Geraldine Mark, and Anne O'Keefe. And in that book we looked at what we call headers and tails. And what these are examples here. If you studied linguistics at university, you will be familiar with a different terminology. And I'm going to mention that in a moment. Jill, David's sister, she's going to New York for her birthday. Now, on the face of it, this appears to have 1, 2, 3 subjects. On the face of it, it appears to break the rule that if you have a noun subject, Jill, you cannot also have a pronoun subject, she. Well, in written grammar, we don't find that. That's true. In written grammar, you do not find a noun and a pronoun referring to the same subject of the same verb. In everyday conversation, we do it all the time. Yeah? All the time. We have a famous one in our corpus which goes, his cousin in London, her boyfriend, his parents bought him a Ford Escort car for his birthday. Listen to it again. His cousin in London, her boyfriend, his parents bought him a car for his birthday. And the other speaker never says, no, wait a minute, I can't process this. Everybody understands it. There's never a problem. In fact, it is much more difficult both to create and to process the classic embedded sentence. The parents of her boyfriend's cousin in London. That's actually quite difficult. I don't know if I got it right. And it's actually quite difficult for you to process it. Now, this goes back to the point that Brazil made, that spoken grammar, because in real time, we put it together like the coaches of a train. And this kind of structure exists in order to help your listener to move from something that they know to something that you're going to tell them. It's like stepping stones on a river or stream. It is a very sympathetic action for your listener. The other type is this. They're not cheap to buy, cars in Singapore. Again, we seem to have two subjects, this time a pronoun first, then a noun phrase, cars in Singapore. This is slightly different from the first one. It's not a stepping stone. The second type, where we put that subject at the end, correlates, routinely correlates with opinions and evaluations. It is a way of saying, this is my opinion. It's not to be heard as a fact. It is to be heard as an opinion. It may be true, but I'm using it because I want to make a point. Don't buy a car in Singapore. You know. Don't go all the way to Singapore and drive it back to England. Now, if you studied linguistics, these phenomena were referred to in linguistics as, I gotta get this right, left dislocation and right dislocation. Okay? Left dislocated structures, right dislocated structures. Fine. The only problem is spoken language doesn't have a left and a right. It happens in time, not in space. Written language does have a left and a right in Western written language. Though, of course, there are cultures and alphabets that move from the right to the left. There are cultures and alphabets that move from the top to the bottom. So what we've done, when we talk about left dislocated structures, we have imported a metaphor from the page, from written language. And what we have to do when we study spoken grammar is to devise a new terminology, a new meta-language, which reflects the fact that spoken language occurs in time, not in space. That's fundamentally important. We need words to describe phenomena that occur in time, not in space. There's another problem with the idea of dislocated structures. Dislocated means something in the wrong place. You know, you could imagine going to a doctor and saying, I've got this pain here. The doctor says, I think you've got a left dislocated structure. A couple of years ago, I fell down a mountain in Italy. We were hiking in the Dolomite Mountains, and I actually fell down a track, and I dislocated my shoulder. Now, that was something wrong and very painful. And I won't describe to you the clicking noise it made when the doctor put it back in, but it was a very painful experience. So when things are dislocated, they're in the wrong place. There's nothing in the wrong place here. Everything is in the right place. There are no left dislocated structures and right dislocated structures in speaking. There is no left, there is no right. There is nothing dislocated. These are located perfectly for the purpose which you have in mind when you use them. They are perfect examples of perfectly located pieces of grammar. So we've chosen instead to call them headers and tails, because it's a sort of headline. It's a bit like a header in an email. Jill, David's sister, now I'm going to tell you something. That's the header. Then the tail. They're not cheap to buy. Now I'm going to tell you what I'm talking about. Cars in Singapore. Now imagine written language. Imagine opening a big encyclopedia, the Encyclopedia Britannica, and you want to read about Shakespeare. So you look up William Shakespeare, and it says, Shakespeare, he's the greatest poet that ever lived in English literature. No, you wouldn't find that. Nor would you find, he was a great poet, Shakespeare. No, what you would find is Shakespeare was a great poet who lived from whatever it was, 15 blah blah to 15 blah blah. So this is quintessentially spoken grammar. We do not find it in written text. So if we take our evidence only from written texts, we will have a distorted view of the grammar. We will have an incorrect view of the grammar. We have to look at speaking. After all, speaking is what most human beings do most of the time. Writing is a minority activity. Most human beings on this planet spend most of their time speaking to one another. And in our global society and our global communications, we will find more and more that speaking is important. Okay, headers and tails, they're important because they facilitate. Topic management. You say, this is my topic. Jill, John's sister, her parents, his cousin, right? That's how I'm laying out my topic. They are sensitive to the listener. You are bringing the listener in to your message. They are an easy, linear construction. You don't need special endings or special syntax. You just put them together like coaches on a train. It's liberation grammar. It's very easy. It's not rocket science. Now, next feature is situational ellipsis. And again, Ronald Carter and I described this in our 2006 book, and Andrew Keynes and Paula Buttery in a lovely article published in 2010, Keynes and Buttery from the University of Cambridge. Ready yet? You talking to me? Hammer, please. Now, these are all three real examples. Ready yet? If I come into the room and I say, ready yet? You don't say, who, me, the dog? Or who are you talking to? It's perfectly obvious what you mean. You talking to me? Sorry, you talking to me? Perfectly obvious. I was working with my dear wife, Jeanne, and we were putting together a piece of furniture, some bookshelf or something. And you know what it's like putting those bits of furniture together. And at some point, I can't remember if she said it to me or I said it to her, one of us said, hammer, please. And the other person didn't say, where, on your head? No, it's always perfectly obvious what is meant by these reduced utterances. Ready yet means, are you ready yet? You talking to me means, are you talking to me? Hammer, please means, give me the hammer or pass me the hammer in this case. So we're talking about a grammar of where things are not there, rather than things which are there. They are things that we consider in some way to be missing. But are they missing? Is anything missing? No, nothing is missing. Language responds to the environment and situation in which it's used. It would be rather absurd for my wife to say to me, would you kindly pass me the hammer, please? The hammer that's on the floor at the moment, the one with the wooden handle and the metal head, and give it to me so that I can hammer in this screw into this piece of furniture. I would think she had lost her mind if she started to speak to me like that. So we can actually turn this upside down, and instead of saying there are things missing from here, instead of saying there are things omitted, we can actually say that it is the grammar of writing which adds material, which actually puts extra things into the sentence, because written texts are usually designed to be read and consumed in a different time, in a different place from when they were written. That's not always the case. Public notices are often very elliptical. There is a shop in the city of Cambridge where students can go and rent bicycles. It's very popular because Cambridge is a nice flat city with no hills, and students can rent bicycles. I drove past that shop one day and there was a sign outside saying, no bicycles. Now I knew what it meant. It meant I've rented them all out, I don't have any more. I then later went along further down the street, and there was a very beautiful shop front, very old shop front, and there was a sign outside saying, no bicycles. And this was a clothes shop, and it said, no bicycles. But I knew what it meant. It meant, do not lean your bicycle against this window. So, no bicycles, which is very elliptical, so just two words, means something different depending on the situation in which it's used, and that's how the grammar works. This is normal spoken grammar. Teachers do it all the time in your classes. Your teacher will say, finished, finished. And nobody says, is she talking to somebody out there in the hallway or what? They know, you know who the teacher is addressing. Now, there are limitations. There are rules to this. We can't come into a room and say, oh, sorry, I'm late. Yeah? That's not grammatical. So we can describe exactly what things you can leave out or not have there, and what things must be there. But to do this, we have to look at a corpus. We have to look at real language. And then we will be able to see which things are not there and which things always have to be there. So ellipsis is a very interesting subject. Okie dokie. It's important because it facilitates context-embedded interaction, what has been called language, situational uses of language, okay? That is language in action, it's often called. Language in action. The language that people use when they're doing things like cooking, moving furniture, arranging a room, driving. Yeah? So if I'm the passenger in the car and I say to my wife, next left, or I say left, she doesn't say, are you accusing me of being a communist radical? No, of course not. She knows exactly what it means. So language in action is a very common way of using spoken language attached to the immediate situation. Informality. Ellipsis creates a very informal relationship. You would not use these types of grammar in very formal situations. Yeah? Yeah? If you were entertaining Queen Elizabeth, you might not say, another cup of tea? She probably wouldn't mind, but most people would probably say, would Your Majesty like another cup of tea? Only a very bold person would say, another cup of tea, Liz? Oh, sorry, I pressed the wrong button. Economy of expression. This corresponds to what I said at the very beginning, that speaking turns in the grammar of speaking are very short. They're not long. We say just as much as we need to say, and no more. Right. Where are we now? This is the conclusion. You will be relieved to hear that I've almost finished. Where are we now? There is now a much greater acceptance of SG, spoken grammar, in applied linguistics. 20 years ago it was considered outrageous. Now, largely speaking, those battles have been won and people accept it as part of the description of English. There are numerous descriptive articles. You can go to any journal, find dozens of articles on spoken grammar. There is influence in the reference grammars. The big grammars of English now are often called grammar of spoken and written English, or written and spoken English, or grammar of spoken English, or exploring spoken English. No advertising, you'll notice. There is an increased acceptance, and this is one of the byproducts of the study of spoken language. We have more respect for varieties and variation. That unlike writing, which tends to orient towards one single standard way of expression, speech is very varied. It is varied geographically. It is varied in terms of social aspects such as gender, education. And as we know, there are many Englishes around the world, and we now respect them as being equal. We no longer say, oh, well, British English is better than Nigerian English or Indian English. All we now say is it's different. They are different. They are varieties of English. But to get there, you need to study the spoken language. Growing influence in course books, the course books that you use, the materials that you use, increasingly now are being influenced by spoken corpora, spoken grammar. And the growing importance of multimodal corpora, because if you want to study the spoken language, in the past we have only had microphones and transcripts on paper. Now it's possible to make very good video recordings, to have video, audio, and a transcript, and a phonetic, spectrogram, all on the same computer screen, so you can see everything that contributes to the message. In my own University of Nottingham, some very important research was done on head movements, the way people do this. The other week I was in Milan, in Italy, and walking down the street I was astonished by the number of people who had a mobile phone at one ear, but were still using all the classic Italian hand gestures. He said, ma no, ci vuole che sono, per le persone, tanto che siate, ma and it was wonderful because the other person at the other end of the phone couldn't see any of this, but it struck me that that's why we need multimodal corpora. We don't want to just record a phone call in Italian, we need to see all these wonderful Italian gestures. The British equivalent is that. Maybe, possibly that. Doesn't go any further. And finally, recent technologies are shifting the divide between spoken and written grammar. I don't think I need to convince you about this, but SMS messages, tweets, emails, blogs, they are a kind of mezzanine territory, a halfway house between speaking and writing. They are written on the computer keyboard, but their grammar is the grammar of speaking. So the grammar of speaking is taking over certain forms of writing. That's all I have to say. Thank you for listening. Doesn't have to be a question, it can be a comment. I don't bite. Any comments? Or?
Can I
Yes.
ask a question?
Wait.
I'm sure people would like to ask other questions too, but somebody has to start. And I have been wondering for a while how multilingualism affects the models you've been speaking about. I mean, when there is a conversation between a native and a non-native speaker, both are using some models of spoken grammar, but the non-native speaker is probably influenced by his or her native patterns. Will that affect understanding, decoding messages?
Okay, so the question is really one of what we call cross-cultural pragmatics. And there was some very good work done on this way back, in fact, in the 1980s by Jenny Thomas, who published articles on what she called cross-cultural pragmatics. There were also pieces of research done on things like business negotiations across cultures, and it's a good example that Ludmilla has raised there. I'll take the example of the business negotiations between different cultures. I cannot, for the moment, remember the name of the person who published this research, but you can find it easily. This researcher looked at business negotiations between Japanese businessmen, and they were all men, and American businessmen, and how they were negotiating and arriving at agreed deals, agreed prices. And the negotiations were recorded, and after the negotiations, the researcher interviewed the American businessmen and the Japanese businessmen. And this is what the results were. Generally speaking, the Americans said, well, you know, these Japanese guys, they're very difficult to negotiate with. It's very, very difficult. Because you ask them something and they don't answer. They're just silent. And they asked the Japanese businessmen, well, what were the problems for you? And they said, these Americans, they don't give you a chance to answer. They just talk all the time. Now, of course, what was being reflected here was the pragmatic value of silence, which you could say is part of the grammar of speaking. Well, I certainly think it is. And that is that in the Japanese culture, when the American business guy said, you know, now, Mr. Yamamoto, my price is $14 per unit. Is that okay with you? The Japanese man would just say, And immediately the American businessman would say, okay, $13.50, that's my final offer, $13.50. And the Japanese would say, okay, 12, and I'm not going lower than 12. which is a very neat explanation for why the economy of Japan was one of the leading economies in the world. But the serious point is that there was what you might call cross-cultural pragmatic failure, that the value of silence in the two cultures was different. In American English, as in British English, you are more or less obliged to fill silence, even if you only make noises. So if someone says to me, now, what is Jean McCarthy's email address? jeanmccarthy@gmail.com. That'd be very strange, wouldn't it? Very strange behavior. Compare that with, what is Jean McCarthy's email address? Ah, no, wait a minute, Jean McCarthy, yes. Yes, now, yes, hang on, yes, I think it's Gmail, hang on a minute. Oh yes, it's Jean McCarthy@gmail.com. So in my culture, silence longer than half a second has a negative value. And if you don't believe me, try it with your own spouse, your boyfriend, your girlfriend, your husband or wife. Next time they say, do you love me? Just pause for 2 seconds. It's the fastest route to the divorce court. The fastest, no, much quicker than a taxi. So these cases that Lumina is raising, these cases of cross-cultural pragmatic failure, are influenced by the way people use grammar. And there are, a good example in the grammar would be something we discovered when we looked at business English. I'll give you a good grammatical example. We were doing the research, Jean and myself and 2 other authors, for a business grammar of English, published by Cambridge. And we were looking at spoken grammar in business discussions. And we used a technique, a computational technique called keyword analysis. Now, I don't want to get too technical here, but it underlines Ludmila's point. Keyword computational analysis does not tell you how frequent a word is. It tells you if a word is statistically significant in any conversation or discourse. Okay? So it's a very powerful computational tool. It says these words are significant fingerprints. They are the DNA of academic English or business English or legal English. And the list we got for business English, for spoken business English, was very interesting. Because we were looking at modal verbs. And we could not find the verb must. Yeah, we wanted to look at how must was used. And we had to go long way down the list to what were called negative keywords. Negative keywords are when the computer says these words are not occurring as often as they should. Right up at the top of the list, word number 3, I think, or number 4, was the verb need. Okay? So we have these 2 anomalies. The verb need, which was occurring much higher than we predicted, and the word must, which was occurring much lower than we predicted. So we had to go into the data, drill into the data, like a dentist. And when you look at the data, what you find is, of course, that need is what bosses say when they give instructions. They say, okay, so we need to get this to Stockholm by 5 p.m. And the other people always say, oh yes, I'll do that right away. Yeah? We need to get this to Stockholm by 5 p.m. The other people don't say, oh, do we? Oh, that's interesting. Yes, very interesting. We don't know if we need. So what we learned from that was that superiors, bosses, use the verb need instead of the verb must. Because if you say, you must get this to Stockholm by 5 o'clock, the other person may think, always giving me too much work, I want to go home at 5 o'clock and see my kids, So instead of you must, significantly frequently we found we need to have a meeting. Oh yes, I'll arrange it immediately. We need to get this to Stockholm. Oh yes, I'll do that straight away. You must arrange a meeting. You must get this to Stockholm by 5 o'clock. No, you get it there yourself. You know. So this is a very good example of the way that the spoken grammar might be pragmatically different across languages. So I have noticed, for example, that in Spanish, situations where you want people to do things in a directive way, you can use more the imperative forms of the verb. The imperative in English is not very frequent. Yeah? It's not very frequent. We do not go into pubs and say, give me a pint of bitter. We can only do that in a pub where we already know the bar staff and where we've been going for 20 years. Go into a strange pub in London and say, give me a pint of bitter, and you will get your pint of bitter probably poured over your head. So the grammar is sensitive in that way, and different languages may have different ways of realizing the relationships that I'm talking about. But every language will have a way of doing it. Every language will have a way of being indirect. Every language will have a way of headlining topics. Every language will have a way of being friendly in its grammar, and that's what we need to learn, these contrasts. That was a long-winded answer, but it was a very profound question. Any others? Any other comments or questions? Don't be afraid. Oh, gosh.
You mentioned that conversational grammar is not something you normally see in a grammar textbook. So for somebody who wants to learn, where does he or she, and I'm using one of the structures you showed, learn about this?
So where do you learn about spoken grammar? This is, of course, an opportunity to do some shameless self-publicity and advertising, which I shouldn't really do. But we have published the Cambridge Grammar of English, which has a lot of information about spoken grammar. English Grammar Today has a lot of information about spoken grammar. If you're interested in the grammar of business, we have Grammar for Business. If you're interested in young people and families chatting to one another, we have Exploring Spoken English, and all of these are published by Cambridge University Press. And of course, in terms of the larger language courses, our courses Touchstone and Viewpoint are both based very heavily on the investigation of spoken grammar and spoken language in general, based on the evidence of corpora. So thank you for giving me that opportunity to shamelessly advertise my own books. I did mention another book up there on the previous slide, so it's not entirely Cambridge stuff. I'm quite an admirer of that book there by Patterson et al. 2012. If you look that up, it's called Spoken Grammar, and it's a series of activities for spoken grammar, and it's not published by Cambridge. So there are books coming out, and you can get hold of these things. And you can find the talk that I've just given published in the journal Applied Linguistics, published last year. And it was published online before it was published in print. Any other comments or